Hello friends, and welcome tonight. We are going to travel very slowly into the old world of ancient Egypt, not by rushing toward kings and monuments, but by drifting there the way a sleepy mind likes to drift. Through warm air, quiet water, moonlit stone, and stories told softly enough to rest inside. This is a night for loosening your thoughts, not sharpening them. A night for letting history arrive in gentle layers. So wherever you are, let yourself settle exactly as you are. There is nothing to solve here, and nothing to keep up with perfectly. You do not need to remember every name, or follow every image all the way to its end. You only need to rest in the sound of the telling until the edges of the day begin to soften. If you like, you may imagine that somewhere beyond your room, there is a river moving through darkness with complete patience. Along its banks stand old columns, sleeping courtyards, lamp-lit chambers, and palms that barely stir in the late wind. Somewhere beneath the stars, desert sand cools after heat. Somewhere incense rises in a narrow blue line and disappears. Somewhere a temple door has just been closed for the night, and somewhere else a lone scholar bends over an old page by lamplight. We will move through all of it in the quiet bedtime way, not by forcing the mind to pay attention, but by giving it something calm enough to follow until it no longer needs to try so hard. So take one easy breath, only as deep as feels natural. Let the shoulders drop a little, let the jaw loosen, let the small muscles around the eyes stop holding on. Another gentle breath, another unhurried exhale. Perhaps the hands grow heavier where they rest. Perhaps the forehead smooths. Perhaps the thoughts that were busy a little while ago begin to stretch into slower shapes. In that softening, the night becomes kinder. In that softening, the mind does not disappear. It simply stops asking so much of itself. And from that quieter place, we can begin. You are standing now, in imagination only, at the edge of the Nile in the late evening. The warmth of the day still lingers faintly in the stone beneath your feet, though the air has already begun to cool. Reeds lean toward the water. The river carries a long ribbon of reflected light, bronze at first, then rose, then a muted silver as the moon climbs higher. Across the bank, a few distant voices drift and fade. Not loud voices, not urgent voices, only the soft signs of life continuing as night settles over the land. A bird moves low above the surface. A small boat, little more than a shadow, glides toward a cluster of lamps. Everything seems to move without hurry, and because everything moves without hurry, the mind begins to follow. Ancient Egypt begins here, not first as spectacle, but as rhythm. Water touching shore, oars dipping and lifting, a night breeze moving through date palms. A shoreline path worn smooth by many quiet feet. It is easy, from this distance in time, to think first of crowns and tombs and enormous stone. But, before all of that, there was the river, and beside the river, there were countless ordinary acts repeated gently from one day to the next. Grain being ground, linen being folded, bread being baked, lamps being lit, prayers being repeated until they became as natural as breathing. Perhaps that is one reason this old world can feel so soothing to visit at night. Beneath all its gold and limestone and sacred language, it was also a world of habits, of evening tasks, of swept thresholds, of low voices, and of bodies growing tired beneath the same sky. As the light thins, you begin to see them in the distance. At first, they seem almost unreal, as though the horizon itself has sharpened into geometry. Then the sky darkens another shade, and the forms become unmistakable. The pyramids rise from the land with that strange union of simplicity and magnitude that makes the heart quiet rather than loud. They are not busy structures. They do not demand. They do not glitter in every direction. They simply endure, broad at the base, narrowing toward heaven. They stand with the stillness of a thought too ancient to be hurried. From far away, they seem almost gentle. From near at hand, they become something else entirely. Not threatening, not exactly, but deeply certain. There is a kind of awe that agitates the mind, and another kind that settles it. The pyramids belong to the second kind. Their great lesson is not spectacle, but patience. Stone lifted and placed, stone measured and aligned, stone facing the sun by day and the stars by night for centuries, beyond counting. They remind you that human beings once poured astonishing effort into the idea of continuity, into the hope that there was meaning not only in life, but in the long passage beyond it. Those rising sides were not made merely to impress the eye. They were part of a larger tenderness toward eternity. They were answers, in stone, to a question that still lives quietly in the human heart. How do we honor what must continue, even after the body rests? For the ancient Egyptians, a tomb of a king was never only a tomb. It was an address in the world beyond sight. It was a chambered promise. It was a prepared passage. To build for the dead was, in a sense, to build for order itself, because a king's journey after death was tied to the well-being of the land he had ruled. The pharaoh was not understood simply as a political ruler. He existed within a sacred pattern. He was connected to the gods, responsible for balance, implicated in the health of the country, not just in taxes and armies, but in the invisible harmony between sky, river, earth, and temple. To us that may feel distant, even mythic. And yet there is something soothing in the coherence of it. Every action belonged to a larger frame. Every ritual, every inscription, every careful act of burial said the same quiet thing. The world is held together by meaning, and meaning can be tended. So imagine those years of building, not as a single heroic gesture, but as a long sequence of days. Dawn over the quarry, the scrape of tools, the call and answer of workers hauling stone, dust on skin, water jars passed hand to hand, sledges creaking over prepared ground, foremen measuring angles, scribes marking tallies, cooks tending fires, priests reciting blessings, afternoon heat pressing itself over everything, then evening, when the light grew softer and shadows lengthened along the unfinished sides. And all that labor, for a little while, rested beneath the same sky that covers us now. Even the greatest monuments were built out of manageable moments. That, too, is a comforting thought. Greatness is often only small effort repeated in trust. At the center of that effort stood the pharaoh, that curious ancient figure who was at once a man, and something more than a man in the imagination of his people. He sat in ceremony, processed through temple courts, received offerings, gave judgments, and was represented in stone with a calm, more perfect than any ordinary human calm. Yet behind the painted walls and carved colossi, there was also mortality. Kings aged, kings died, kings had to be mourned, preserved, and sent onward, just like any other soul, only with a greater architecture of ritual around them. Their names were enclosed in cartouches, their deeds were carved into walls, their bodies were prepared for a journey whose seriousness shaped an entire civilization. It is tempting, when speaking of kings, to lean into grandeur alone, but the softer truth lies elsewhere. The pharaoh's body had to be washed, linen had to be folded, oils had to be poured, amulets had to be chosen and placed. Sarcophagi had to be carved, fitted, and sealed. Priests had to memorize words and speak them in the right order. Mourners had to weep, artisans had to paint scenes of fields, boats, offerings, servants, gods, and stars, so that the dead would not enter emptiness, but a familiar and prepared abundance. There is a tenderness in all that preparation. To preserve a body was not merely to resist decay. It was to say that the self was worth escorting carefully toward whatever came next. And so the old embalmers worked in their scented rooms with hands trained by repetition and reverence. Reasons warmed, linen strips weighted in neat stacks, vessels were filled, sacred objects were arranged. What might seem to a modern eye like a strange science of death was, for them, a practical devotion to continuity. The soul, or rather the many aspects of the self they believed in, required recognition, protection, and a body not wholly abandoned to ruin. The wrapped form became a kind of pause between worlds. The tomb became a storehouse for identity, food for hunger, games for pleasure, furniture for comfort, texts for guidance, charms for defense. Nothing was casual, nothing was entirely decorative. Each object served the calm and ordered hope that the one who had died would not be lost. Beyond the tombs stood the temples, where daily life met the divine not in a single burst of revelation, but in routine. At dawn the doors were opened, lamps were trimmed, incense was lit, offerings were arranged with care. Priests moved through shadowed halls whose walls were thick with carved scenes of gods enthroned. Kings presenting gifts, enemies subdued, lotus flowers opening, stars sailing across ceilings painted in deep colors. In those spaces the world was renewed by attention. That is perhaps one of the most beautiful features of ancient Egyptian religion. Order was not assumed to continue by itself. It had to be refreshed. It had to be served. It had to be enacted through repeated gestures of care. The word the Egyptians gave to that order was mat, and though no single English word can fully hold it, we may drift near it through ideas like balance, truth, rightness, harmony. Mat was what kept the river returning, what kept the sun rising, what made justice more than force, what distinguished a properly aligned world from one leaning toward disorder. The pharaoh upheld mat, the temples embodied mat, daily rituals nourished mat, even ordinary honesty and fairness belonged to it. There is something deeply restful in that vision. The sense that the universe has a shape, and that human beings, by acting carefully, can participate in its steadiness. Whether or not we share the belief, we can feel the calm that comes from imagining a world where order is not abstract, but tended lovingly each day. In temple courtyards and household rooms alike, there was another force moving quietly through life. Heka, the power of sacred speech and operative symbol, the current of what we might loosely call magic. Yet in Egypt, it was not a theatrical interruption of reality. It was woven into reality, a spoken formula over medicine. A protective amulet worn at the throat, a carved image placed near the dead, a blessing recited before travel. Words mattered because words shaped pathways. Symbols mattered because symbols held the world in patterns the eye could not always see. Even fear was answered through ceremony. Even uncertainty was met with ritual. There is comfort in that. The unknown was not left blank. It was met with form. No object expresses that better than the funerary texts we now gather under the name Book of the Dead. Not a single book in the modern sense, and not identical in every tomb. These texts offered spells, instructions, and passages of protection for the soul's journey after death. They were companions of language. They did not erase danger so much as help one move through it. To know the names of gates, of guardians, of powers encountered beyond the grave, was to travel with greater confidence. Words became shelter, memory became a map. The afterlife, no less than earthly life, could be navigated with preparation. And so the old world layered its wisdom in papyrus and pigment, in gold and faience, in whispered recitation and temple chant, until death itself seemed less like an abyss and more like a difficult crossing for which one might still pack provisions. By now the night has deepened around the river, the stars are clearer, the pyramids no longer hold the last warmth of day, but a pale lunar hush. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal cries once, then falls silent. The air is cooler now, easier on the skin, and the images of Egypt begin to shift from broad history towards something more intimate, more story-shaped. This is the way with old places. When you rest in them long enough, the facts soften into rooms, into footsteps, into the rustle of cloth, into a lamp burning on a table beside a rolled manuscript. The world of temples, kings, and sacred language does not vanish. It narrows, gently, into one evening, one camp, two scholars waiting beneath a darkening sky. Their camp stood on a low stretch of desert, not far from the greener line of cultivation, where the land slowly surrendered itself to sand and open stone. By day the place had looked unimpressive, just another patient reach of earth beneath a severe sun. But at night, it became a threshold, a canvas tent, breathed lightly in the wind. A brass lantern sent a small amber circle across a folding table. Water skins rested in the shadow of supply crates. Instruments, notebooks, and brushes lay sorted with the neatness that belongs to people who know that small objects matter in large discoveries. Above everything, the sky widened without mercy or obstruction, rich with stars. The older of the two scholars in manner, though not by many years, was named Elias Ward. He had a face that seemed carved out of concentration, all thoughtful angles and half-faded weariness. The sort of face made memorable less by symmetry than by absorption. He had been an archaeologist long enough to distrust grand claims, and recent enough in his ambition to keep making them in private. Beside him sat Layla Hart, whose gift was language, not only the formal language of inscriptions and fragments, but the subtler language of patterns, omissions, and tone. She had an instinct for hidden structure, for the way one script could lean beneath another, for the clue left by an unexpected choice of sign. Where Elias saw layers of soil and masonry, Layla saw layers of intention. The object that had brought them here lay between them in a linen wrap. By lantern light it looked modest, almost too modest for the weeks of study it had demanded. It was not a complete scroll, but several surviving lengths of papyrus mounted temporarily between protective sheets, enough to preserve the continuity of a text whose origin neither of them could fully name. The signs upon it were unsettling in the most scholarly sense. Not grotesque, not sensational, simply wrong in a way that excited the mind. Familiar forms appeared in unfamiliar combinations. Certain royal formulas were present, then subtly altered. Astral signs recurred where funerary ones might have been expected. And beneath it all lay an older stratum, a residue of archaic design almost hidden inside later writing, like the memory of an earlier voice speaking beneath a newer one. They had not found the papyrus in a golden chamber, or bought it from a dramatic stranger in a crowded market. It had surfaced much more quietly, in a neglected archive bundle miscatalogued under trade accounts from a later period, where its importance might have remained unnoticed for years if Layla had not paused over a damaged margin and recognized a sign too early for the date attached to it. From that patient mistake grew weeks of work, ink analysis, fiber examination, comparative notes, lists of unusual determinatives. Pages of tentative transliteration crossed out and begun again. Their progress had not come as revelation, but as accretion, until one evening, when the sky outside Layla's study window had gone entirely black, a pattern settled into view. The text was not descriptive, it was instructive, not a record of what had been found, but a guide to where something might appear. It spoke, in veiled and ceremonial language, of a structure hidden by the favor of darkness, and shown only when certain stars leaned into agreement above the western desert. It hinted at a burial set apart from the official memory of kings. It named no pharaoh directly. It invoked no known burial site. Instead, it circled around absences, warning that the place had been withheld from ordinary knowledge and preserved through concealment rather than glory. Such language should have made them cautious, and it did. But caution and fascination have long lived beside each other in the minds of scholars. And so here they were, having translated just enough to be compelled, and not nearly enough to be entirely comfortable. Layla lifted the papyrus carefully, and compared one cluster of signs to the sky above. Elias unfolded the map that had by now been opened and reopened so many times that the corners had gone soft. The location they had chosen was the result of geometry more than certainty. Lines extended from ruined markers, horizon calculations, references to seasonal alignments, and a repeated phrase that seemed to describe a ridge shaped like the back of a reclining lion. For hours they had waited in the thinning heat of sunset with almost nothing to reward them. Then the night matured, the moon rose clear, a bright star appeared low to the south, another sharpened to the east. Layla looked up, then quickly again. the way someone does when the world makes a promise and she fears she has imagined it. At first the sand seemed merely restless, a shallow trembling of surface grain under wind. Then the movement organized itself, a broad patch of darkness deepened where no darkness should have been. The outline was not sudden, it gathered, edge by edge, plane by plane, as though something enormous were deciding, after a very long hesitation, to permit itself to be seen. No crack of thunder marked its return, no dramatic collapse of earth, only the deeply unnerving grace of emergence, a slope, then another, a line too straight to be natural, a mass too symmetrical to deny. Before them, under moonlight, stood the half-buried form of a pyramid no map had taught them to expect. Neither of them spoke for several moments, and perhaps that silence was the most honest response. Awe is often quiet first. The structure did not glitter or glow with theatrical power. It stood in pale stillness, its stones muted by centuries of sand, its apex blunted by time or burial, its base mostly swallowed by the desert's patient appetite. Yet, even in its worn state, it possessed the unmistakable authority of deliberate architecture. Elias felt the familiar scholar's urge to name, measure, classify, compare. Lila felt something slightly older and more intuitive, the sense that they had crossed an unseen threshold and should move with the manners appropriate to that fact. In the end, both impulses guided them. They packed only what was needed. They raised the lanterns, and step by measured step, they approached the entrance the papyrus had predicted. The outer carvings were shallow from abrasion, but not erased. Lila brushed the surface gently with gloved fingers and felt the faint ridges of signs cut into stone long before either of them had been imagined. Protective formulas appeared first, though not the common ones. Instead of declaring simple defense, they framed the entrance as a place of selection. The unready would not merely be excluded, but misled. The impatient would be turned back by their own haste. The unseeing would pass beside the door and find only wall. Elias, who trusted mechanisms more readily than warnings, searched along the seams until his hands paused on a recessed panel, almost lost beneath sand. Pressure, angle, leverage, old engineering still speaking through resistance. The stone shuddered once, then gave inward with a sound softer than expected, as though the pyramid had opened its mouth after a very long silence. The air inside was astonishingly cool. It carried the mineral scent of enclosed stone with a trace of older dryness beneath it. A breath untouched by moonlight for ages beyond reckoning. Their lamp flames narrowed in the stillness. The first corridor angled downward with an economy that felt ceremonial rather than practical. Its walls close enough to encourage attention, but not claustrophobia. On either side, bands of carved imagery repeated in careful sequence. Stars, boats, jackals, crossed reeds, a seated figure whose face had been deliberately left featureless, and a recurring emblem that neither scholar recognized at once. Something between a darkened disc and an opened eye. The floor underfoot was level more often than not, yet every few yards Elias paused to test a stone before trusting it fully. A pyramid that had hidden itself through celestial timing could reasonably be expected to hide other things as well. Yet the place was less like a trap than a conversation conducted through architecture. One passage narrowed to slow them, another bent sharply, so that they had to turn with the wall rather than stride carelessly forward. At a junction where dust lay undisturbed, Layla noticed that the carved figures on the left side faced inward, while those on the right faced away. Not decoration then, but instruction. They followed the facing figures and found, after a seemingly blank stretch, a slit of darkness that widened into the next corridor. Again and again the structure rewarded observation over force. That, more than any threat, gave the interior its peculiar dignity. It did not rage against intruders, it simply insisted on being read correctly. Farther in, the carvings changed. The familiar vocabulary of kingship and afterlife remained, but it was now overlaid with astral motifs in greater density. Ceilings displayed constellated nets of stars, Certain wall panels arranged crescents and discs in sequences that suggested motion across time, not merely symbolic placement. Lila began to suspect that the pyramid was not only hidden by the heavens, but conceptually organized by them. In one chamber, too low to stand fully upright, they found a frieze of repeated celestial boats sailing across a black-painted band. Each boat carrying not a god, but a sealed shrine. In another, Elias's lamp revealed a circle of stone sockets on the floor, surrounding a central plinth, as though objects once stood there to mark positions or cast shadows. The entire monument seemed less like a royal vanity and more like an instrument built by minds obsessed with alignment, transition, and guarded disclosure. Eventually, the descending passages opened into a wider chamber where the air changed again, becoming faintly heavier, as though the room had waited more completely sealed than the corridors behind it. Here, the walls were covered not with long narrative scenes, but with clustered symbols set in shallow relief. Elias lifted the lamp higher. Roundels, arcs, seven-pointed forms, vertical groups of stars, lines crossing at angled intervals. They had entered, unmistakably, a room of arrangement. Lila set down her satchel and removed the copy diagram she had made from the papyrus weeks earlier. Under the wavering light, the resemblance became undeniable. The manuscript had not merely described the chamber. It had abstracted it. Together they began to work, not with frantic excitement, but with the absorbed calm of people doing the thing for which many earlier hours have prepared them. The chamber held several movable stone pieces fitted within recessed channels, each bearing one of the repeated celestial signs. Time disappeared into concentration. Elias tested weight and balance. Layla compared sequence to sky charts from the alignment night. Once, they tried an arrangement that felt elegant but yielded nothing. Another time, a nearly correct pattern produced a low internal click, and then stillness, as though the room had acknowledged their approach, while withholding completion. Dust caught the lamplight, their sleeves collected grit. Outside, though neither could see it, the moon continued across its appointed path. At last Layla stopped with her hand over a carved disc, and smiled the tired, astonished smile of recognition. "Not the stars alone," she whispered, "but the order in which they become visible from the desert at this season." It was a subtle difference, the difference between theory and lived observation, between a scholarly chart and the sky as an ancient watcher would have actually experienced it. They adjusted 3 pieces accordingly. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the central plinth trembled, somewhere inside the wall. Stone scraped stone, in a vast and measured movement. A panel ahead withdrew by degrees, shedding fine streams of dust, and revealed a dark opening beyond. What waited past that threshold was not crude danger or treasure in the simple sense, but a chamber so still that both scholars lowered their voices without deciding to do so. It was higher than the rooms before it, with a ceiling lost in shadow and a long central axis leading toward a raised stone bier. Along the walls stood statues of priestly figures, not gods, each one holding an object against the chest: a rod, a folded cloth, a sealed vessel, a disc. Their faces were not individualized, but neither were they blank. Instead, they wore expressions of composed attendance, as if they had been waiting together through centuries of dark. Between them, faint traces of pigment still clung to carved signs. Deep blue in one groove, gold in another, the remains of a world more vivid than the stone now allowed. Upon the bier rested a sarcophagus narrower than a king's would have been, but worked with extraordinary care. The lid showed no royal uraeus, no boastful titulary. Instead, it bore the same darkened disc and opened eye they had seen throughout the monument, now framed by stars descending like rain. At the 4 corners of the bier sat alabaster bowls crusted at the rim with ancient resin. Lila's breath caught when she noticed that the bowls were arranged according to cardinal direction. Elias, for once, did not reach immediately for measurement or notes. Something in the chamber pressed gently but unmistakably toward reverence. They stood there long enough for silence to settle through them, and only then drew near. When the lid was finally shifted, it moved with more willingness than either expected, as though dryness had preserved not only the stone, but its obedience. Inside lay the wrapped form of a man, smaller than the architecture surrounding him had suggested, crowned not with a royal diadem, but with a rigid ceremonial headdress worked in dark stone beads. His hands, crossed neatly over the chest, held an object around which the strips of linen had been parted with improbable precision. It was not gold, nor faience, nor any familiar funerary amulet. It was a crystal of cloudy translucence, elongated and many-faceted, mounted within a frame of tarnished metal. Even under weak lamplight it seemed to gather brightness rather than reflect it. Not a dramatic blaze, more like a patient inner pulse, as though the object preferred its own rhythm to that of the room. Elias leaned closer. Lila, almost against her will, extended a hand toward the metal setting but stopped before contact. The effect it had upon them was difficult to name. The chamber did not suddenly roar or convulse. The statues did not come alive. Instead, the entire space seemed to acquire another depth, as if a second room made of memory or intention had briefly aligned with the visible one. The air tightened, the lamp flame thinned and bent. Somewhere in the architecture, a low hum emerged, so faint it might have been mistaken for the pulse in the ears. Elias, unable to resist the scholar's doomed instinct to test what is before him, touched one finger lightly to the frame. The sensation that followed was not pain, but a swift and total displacement, as though his body remained where it was, while his perception was carried several strides outward into some vaster arrangement. For an instant, he felt the monument not as separate rooms, but as one coherent device, tuned to sky, stone, season, and burial. He glimpsed patterns of light crossing chambers. He sensed the object as a node in a larger design, neither wholly sacred nor wholly technical by any modern division. Then the feeling passed. He staggered back, not injured, only emptied. Layla caught his arm. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. When words returned, they did so quietly. "It was enough," she said, "more than enough." Elias, pale and strangely calm, nodded. They did not take the crystal. They did not unwrap the figure further. They made notes in the spare, disciplined way of people who know that greed often begins in the language of documentation. A few measurements, sketches, observations on materials and layout. Then, with the same care they would have wished for themselves in some imagined future chamber, they replaced the lid. The low hum in the walls subsided. The room resumed its prior depth of stillness, and the scholars turned back toward the passage through which they had entered, carrying not an object, but an altered understanding. The ascent felt longer than the descent, as ascents often do, though perhaps it was only the body asking again for open air and ordinary sky. The corridors remained just as narrow, the inscriptions just as restrained, yet now everything seemed gentler, as though the pyramid, having allowed them inward and outward in one lifetime of moonlight, no longer needed to prove anything. At the threshold, the desert air touched their faces like cool water. They stepped back into a world of sand, stars, and distance. Behind them, the hidden monument kept its pale edges for a little while longer. Before them stretched the familiar disorder of open land, wonderfully free of walls. Their small camp lantern still burned in the distance, an almost humble sight after so much stone and secrecy. They walked toward it slowly, saying little. There are discoveries that produce immediate speech, argument, cataloging, plans for publication, calculations of importance. And there are others that enlarge the inner life first, leaving spoken summary feeling thin for several hours. This was one of those. Elias sat on a crate with both hands around a cup of water he did not yet drink. Lila wrote 3 lines in her notebook, then stopped, as though language needed time to become adequate again. The moon crossed on. A fox called once from somewhere unseen. Sand shifted against the tent ropes with a faint whispering sound. Later, when they spoke, It was not of fame or ownership. They spoke of the way the chamber had been organized, of the repeated disc and eye sign, of the possibility that some branches of Egyptian funerary practice may have held more experimental or esoteric dimensions than surviving mainstream evidence had suggested. They spoke of the crystal only carefully, and never with the vocabulary of sensational marvel. If it had a physical function, it was embedded in ritual. If it had a ritual function, it was shaped through material knowledge. Either way, it belonged to a category broader than modern convenience allowed. By the time the conversation loosened into silence again, the first astonishment had begun to mellow into something more fitting for the night: wonder without appetite. And this is where the mind, having been asked to travel inward and downward, may rest for a while in the open. We leave the pyramid behind us, not erased, only softened by distance. We let the moon widen over the desert. We let the wind move across the low ridges. We return to the broader Egypt that holds not one hidden chamber, but thousands of remembered and forgotten places, each with its own silence, each with its own way of waiting. Think of temple roofs cooling after day. Think of painted columns standing in dim processional light. Think of river waters sliding past moored boats while priests in white linen cross a court before dawn. Think of scribes bent over reed pens. Think of women braiding children's hair in courtyards. Think of lamps being extinguished one by one. Whole civilizations survive not only in what they declare, but in what they repeat. Egypt repeated its mornings, its offerings, its festivals, its harvests, its funerary formulas, its household tasks, its prayers to visible and invisible powers. Even its mysteries were held inside routines. That may be why it rests so naturally in the imagination before sleep. It is full of splendor, yes, but splendor contained by order. Full of secrets, yes, but secrets housed within forms. A mystery enclosed by ritual becomes gentler. A vast belief, carried by daily action, becomes easier to inhabit. So we settle there again, in the wide old landscape, and from that landscape another story begins. Not with scholars this time, but with a boy moving through a market at dusk. He was called Samir, and in the dense evening streets of Thebes, he could pass through a crowd with the unremarkable grace of water finding its level. He was young enough to be underestimated, old enough to know exactly how useful that was. His hair, dark and sun-browned at the edges, curled lightly at the nape of his neck. His tunic had been mended more than once. His sandals were thin. Nothing about him invited a second look, and that, for a boy who sometimes lived by taking what wealthier hands failed to guard, was a kind of talent. The marketplace in which he moved had begun the slow turn from trade to night. The hottest part of the day was gone. Fruit sellers dampened woven mats. Potters covered their wares. Perfume clung to the shade beneath awnings. Voices folded over one another in bargaining, laughter, complaint, and farewell. Samir watched the square not with greed but with concentration. Hunger had taught him that theft, if one insisted on it, should be clean, quick, and reserved for those whose lives would not be harmed by a missing pouch. There are moral codes even among the small, desperate arts. And he had assembled one from instinct, necessity, and the memory of too many empty evenings. So he did not touch the old. He did not touch laborers who counted copper with careful fingers. He did not touch mothers carrying baskets and children together. Instead, he studied a merchant whose robe hem was embroidered richly enough to announce comfort, and whose attention was divided between two assistants: a complaint about storage jars, and his own opinion of his importance. The move itself was hardly dramatic, a slight misstep, an apology murmured with downcast eyes. A hand already withdrawing before the man fully felt the tug at his belt. Then Samir was gone into motion, not running, which attracts pursuit, but folding sideways into the market's ordinary current. Past the garlic stall, between two donkeys, along the linen awnings, through a narrow cut between stacked baskets, by the time the merchant discovered his lighter side and began to bark outrage at the fading light. The boy had already entered a side lane where the smells changed from market spice to cooling brick and old water jars. There he crouched beneath a wall lamp and untied the pouch with quick fingers, less excited by the money itself than by the brief certainty it represented. Bread, dried figs, perhaps lamp oil, perhaps a scrap of meat, if luck and generosity aligned in the same evening. He was still counting when he heard the voice. It did not shout, it did not accuse, it simply arrived from the shadow beside the wall, with the kind of calm that makes a person freeze more completely than anger would. "You move like someone who has practiced not being seen," it said. Samir looked up too quickly and nearly dropped the coins. The man who stepped into the circle of light was not richly dressed. That made him more difficult to read. He wore a travel-stained cloak and the patient expression of someone who had spent many years watching before speaking. One side of his face was marked by a thin scar that did not spoil his features so much as harden their history. He did not reach for the pouch. He did not threaten to call guards. Instead, he regarded the boy with measured interest, the way a craftsman might examine a tool found unexpectedly in ordinary dust. Samir's first instinct was flight. His second, slower and stranger, was curiosity. The man gave his name as Harun, whether that was the only name he used, or even the truest, Samir could not have known. What mattered more was the offer that followed, not kindness. Exactly, not rescue. Harun did not speak like a sentimental man. He spoke of skill, of discipline, of waste. He said that talent without direction turned inward and devoured the life that contained it. He said the city was full of boys quick with their hands and empty of future. He said there were older forms of knowledge than hunger and fear. Samir, who had learned to distrust every easy promise, would have laughed if the man's eyes had not remained so completely free of persuasion. It was not a salesman's invitation, it was closer to recognition. By the end of the night, the stolen pouch had been returned. By means Harun arranged without spectacle, and Samir found himself riding in silence beyond the city's outer dwellings, toward a tract of desert he had never before crossed. The moon was already high. Behind them, Thebes settled under darkness, its roof silvered, its temple pylons looming above sleeping courtyards and late fires. Ahead waited a canyon hidden among broken outcrops and wind-shaped stone. There, set back behind a veil of rock and shadow, lived a small fraternity Harun served. A brotherhood whose members called themselves the Veiled Reed, after the plant that bends without breaking and grows where water is near, though the surface looks dry. Their order was neither army nor monastery, though it borrowed temperaments from both. It had messengers, observers, readers of signs, keepers of routes, and a few whose tasks could not be named plainly, even among themselves. Some had once served in temples, some had worked in courts, some had disappeared from lives that no longer held them. They valued memory, restraint, and the ability to move through crowded worlds without gathering attention. To a starving boy, this could have become a fantasy of importance. Instead, it became something steadier, routine, training, correction, repetition. Samir learned that the hidden life is mostly made of ordinary effort. Mornings began before sunrise while the desert was still blue and cold enough to make the breath visible. He learned balance on uneven stone. He learned how much sound a sandal makes on grit versus packed earth versus tile. He learned to look at a room and remember, after only a glance, where the openings were, who carried keys, which objects had recently been touched, which shadows would vanish when the moon moved another finger's width. Afternoons were given to endurance and practical tasks. Fetching water, mending tack, grinding pigment, sweeping the archive room where papyrus dust gathered inside reed baskets. Nights, when not assigned to errands, belonged to study. That surprised him most. He had expected secrecy to consist of blades, codes, and whispered plans. He had not expected so much reading. Harun, who taught with dry precision, placed simple text before him first. Lists, accounts, copied proverbs, fragments of instruction. Then he added maps, symbolic diagrams, excerpts from older funerary and temple texts, practical notes on households, accents, routes, and the habits of officials. "A man who wishes to enter forbidden places," Harun once said while correcting Samir's grip on a stylus, "must first learn why those places exist. Otherwise he enters only walls, never meaning." It was the sort of sentence the boy did not fully understand at first, and later found residing in him as firmly as bone. Years did what years always do. They lengthened him. They broadened the shoulders that had once seemed too narrow for adulthood. They gave him scars on the forearms and a stillness in the gaze that strangers might mistake for indifference. He traveled on assignments, small enough to teach obedience without inviting glory. Carry a message, watch a house, confirm a rumor, escort a document. Learn a servant's routines. Notice which priest drinks too much after the evening meal, and which scribe quarrels with his brother about inheritance. Such work did not sound noble, yet it turned his mind outward and trained him to see human life as patterns rather than isolated events. In time, the brotherhood trusted him with more. Then came the assignment that altered the air around everything. He was summoned not to the training court or archive room, but to the inner chamber where the order's senior keepers met when a matter touched the wider balance of cities, temples, and rulers. The chamber itself was plain by royal standards: whitewashed walls, a central table, lamps trimmed low, bowls of water set near the corners to cool the space and catch dust. Yet the gravity of what occurred there gave it a solemnity richer than ornament. Harun stood at one end beside two older figures Samir had seen only rarely. No one raised a voice, no one needed to. A funerary text of unusual power had been drawn into the private collection of a provincial king recently strengthened by ambition and flattery. The ruler, whose taste for sacred objects exceeded his wisdom in using them, had begun consulting a set of interpreters eager to tell him what he wished to hear. The document in question was no ordinary copy meant for burial. It contained a sequence of invocations and adjudicatory passages from an older recension, one layered with temple variants and protective names largely lost in standard circulation. In simpler terms, it was the kind of text that turns rulers inward toward obsession when they begin to believe that immortality is a procedure rather than a mystery. The Brotherhood did not fear magic in the childish sense. It feared power joined to vanity. Samir listened without movement. The task was clear even before Harun spoke it plainly. Enter the palace during the upcoming festival, when gates, storerooms, kitchens, guest quarters, and processional routes would all be in greater motion than usual. Reach the restricted library attached to the ruler's private sanctuary. Recover the text if possible. If not, determine its location and the degree of protection around it. Do no public harm. Do not allow the mission to expand into revenge or spectacle. It was a hard command, because Samir, like many who grew up in streets subject to official cruelty, carried private grudges against palaces simply for being palaces. Harun seemed to see the thought before it fully formed. "This is not a mission against wealth," he said in the measured tone Samir still obeyed as if from childhood. "It is a mission against misuse. Remember the difference." The distinction steadied him. To act from anger narrows the eye. To act from responsibility enlarges it. When the meeting ended, he returned to his sleeping room, knelt a moment in the dark without formal prayer, and began assembling the small things that matter most when one hopes to be overlooked. Plain linen, a spare headcloth, soft-soled sandals, waxed thread, a narrow knife, rolled copies of simple delivery tallies, a packet of dates, and a ring bearing the broken seal of a household supplier, no longer living. Nothing gleamed, nothing invited admiration. To enter the palace he would need help from within, and for that he traveled back toward the city to find Mina, once a junior linen attendant in a noble household, and later, a trusted informant whose memory for service passages and domestic routines outshone the formal knowledge of many officials. Once a junior, she received him at a modest drinking room near the edge of the service quarter, where the wine was watered, the music untrained, and the company disinclined to ask questions if a tip was placed carefully enough. Time had refined her presence, rather than softened it. She spoke little before listening, and noticed everything before deciding what to reveal. When Samir explained the matter, she did not dramatize it. She merely leaned back, tapped one finger against the cup, and said the festival would give them the nearest thing to permission that such a place ever offered. The next evening, the city altered itself for celebration. Garlands hung across streets, priests prepared processional bark shrines, children ran among adults who pretended annoyance and failed to mean it. Musicians tested reeds and drums. The smell of fresh bread mingled with incense, crushed herbs, lamp oil, and the slightly metallic scent of polished bronze in evening air. For sleep-telling, this part of the story moves not in alarm, but in texture. See the linen bright in torchlight, see the flower chains fading slowly as darkness deepens. Hear the layered rhythm of footsteps, murmurs, and ritual music from farther in. The city is crowded enough to conceal, loud enough to soften small mistakes, and beautiful enough that even secrecy can pass through it without becoming harsh. Mina led him by the practical edges of ceremony, never through the central route, where beauty becomes scrutiny. Always through the working arteries that keep beauty alive. Past the bakery court, where trays were stacked beside warm walls. Through a side yard where servants folded festival hangings no one had yet thought to remove. Along a corridor cool with stored amphorae, behind a chamber where attendants laughed too loudly because they were tired. Through a narrow door masked by hanging reed mats. Every palace, however grand, depends on hidden circulation. Food arrives, laundry moves, water is carried, broken things are mended, ash is swept, messages pass, a ruler may live in display, but the household survives by roots too humble for ceremony. Mina knew them all. At last she stopped where the service quarter gave way to a more solemn and restricted interior. Ahead, the walls changed character, the plaster was smoother. The scenes painted upon it shifted from domestic abundance to sacred authority. Gods seated in profile, standards carried high, captives bound beneath ordered feet, stars repeated in disciplined rows across dark blue ceiling bands. Here the palace ceased pretending to be merely a very large house and remembered that it wished to resemble a cosmos. Mina touched Samir's sleeve once, briefly. "From here," she said, "I cannot be useful without becoming visible." He nodded. In such work, gratitude is often too risky to linger upon. Yet he carried it with him as he stepped alone into the quieter heart of the building. The deeper halls did not feel dramatic in the crude sense. They felt curated. Doors stood where they ought to. Lamps were trimmed exactly. Guards occupied spaces chosen not only for defense, but for symbolism. The floor underfoot changed from service-worn stone to smoother slabs that preserved footsteps differently. In one gallery, the walls were painted with scenes of judgment in the afterlife, scales, deities, a heart presented for weighing. In another stood black stone statues so polished that flame rippled dimly in their surfaces. Samir moved when guards turned at the ends of habitual patterns. When a chant from the outer courts briefly swelled, when a servant carrying water distracted the eye merely by being expected. Good concealment is often less about invisibility than about timing oneself into the habits of others. At the end of a narrow passage half veiled by a carved screen, he found the door Mina had described. It was not large, but it had presence. Dark wood banded with bronze, inlaid symbols of protection, no simple lock to pick from outside. Instead, at the center, a shallow panel bearing a pattern of crossed reeds and a crescent over a closed eye. Samir studied it by lamplight and saw at once that it was not ornamental alone. A recess, barely visible, waited along the panel's lower edge. From within his sleeve he drew the broken supplier's seal set in a ring, not because it would open the room, but because Mina had guessed correctly that a service credential, altered and pressed at an angle, might release the first catch used during cleaning and inventory. It did. The door eased inward by a finger's width. Beyond lay a chamber lined with shelves and storage chests. Quieter than any room he had entered so far. Not a public library then, but a controlled repository, perhaps used by the ruler's readers and ritual advisors. The air smelled of cedar, papyrus, dust, and old resin. A moonbeam entered through a high slit in the wall and laid a pale stripe across the floor. In that stripe stood a reading stand, and upon it rested the text he had been sent to find. Its case was wrapped in darkened leather, its ties sealed but not untouched. Someone had been consulting it repeatedly. Several loose fragments nearby showed recent handling. A dish of ash still held the warmth of extinguished incense. The room felt less abandoned than paused, as though whoever used it intended to return before the night was over. Samir approached with the same care one uses around another person's sleeping grief. He loosened the case ties and opened the cover enough to view the first columns. The writing was elegant, older than the supporting notes tucked beside it, and denser with sacred names than common funerary copies. It was not its age alone that altered the room, but its tone. Certain texts invite reading. This one imposed pace. It moved through threshold language. Declarations of identity, refusals of annihilation, negotiated passage, and formulas of alignment between the human dead and cosmic order. More than once he had to slow his breathing without meaning to. The text did not feel evil. That would have been easier. It felt potent in the way any concentrated symbolic system feels potent when joined to ambition. Beside the reading stand lay a wax tablet covered with a ruler's private notes. Samir should have ignored it. Instead, sensing that understanding might matter as much as removal, he lifted it and read by moonlight. The hand was controlled, but increasingly erratic toward the lower lines. There were references to divine accession, to extending presence beyond the ordinary term of kingship, to mastering fear through access to hidden names. Several notes broke off mid-thought, as though the writer had mistaken obsession for revelation and tired himself trying to turn sacred language into mechanical advantage. In that moment the mission clarified. He had been sent to recover an object, but the deeper necessity was to interrupt a fantasy. Some powers do not disturb the world by force first. They corrupt by persuasion. He closed the tablet, looked again at the text, and realized with a kind of cold peace that no faction, including his own, should possess it casually. Hidden knowledge was not automatically safe in hidden hands. The Brotherhood had more discipline than the ruler. Yes, it had broader purpose, yet Samir had lived long enough among institutions to know that anything guarded for the right reasons in one generation may be coveted for poorer reasons in the next. The thought did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as responsibility. He wrapped the manuscript, extinguished the ash dish fully, and left the chamber the way he had entered, carrying the text under plain linen, as though it were laundry. Getting out demanded less cleverness than entering, because departure rides the same routes if haste does not spoil it. He retraced Mina's instructions by sound as much as sight. A burst of festival drums from the outer court masked his passage through the side gallery. Two servants arguing over missing cups created the perfect drift of attention near the storage court. A pair of guards, more tired than vigilant, accepted the sight of one more linen bearer moving briskly toward the rear gate. Soon he was beyond the palace wall, then beyond the thickest streets, then astride a small borrowed horse waiting in shadow where Mina had arranged it. He did not ride fast at first. Fast riding invites memory. He rode like a man with a task of no great distinction, until the city loosened behind him into darkness and open land. Only then did he turn toward the outer desert. The night was clear and dry. Sand gave back moonlight in pale sweeps between darker ridges. The horses breathing, the creak of leather, and the distant pulse of festival music fading behind him became the whole world for a while. It would have been simplest to return directly to the Brotherhood's canyon. Instead, he angled southward toward a low oasis he had known from earlier journeys. A place sheltered by tamarisk and rock, where water rose cold enough to surprise the mouth after hours of dust. The decision felt less like choosing than remembering something already decided in a part of him faster than speech. The oasis lay in a shallow basin, hidden until one was nearly upon it. Palms leaned over a pool that reflected the moon in broken silver. Frogs sounded once or twice among reeds. The air there was cooler, touched by moisture, fragrant with mud and green life, so modest it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not thirsty. Samir dismounted, let the horse drink, and sat for a moment on the bank with the wrapped manuscript across his knees. How many people, he wondered briefly, had dreamed of owning such a text? How many had imagined mastery where reverence was required? How many would again? Then he stood, found a place where the ground was softer between two young palms, and began to dig. It was not noble-looking work, just a man in plain linen, using a travel shovel and his own hands in turns, setting aside damp soil in careful piles, pausing now and then to listen to the night. Yet there was dignity in it. To bury a dangerous longing before it could become another man's crown was its own kind of service. When the hole was deep enough, he wrapped the manuscript once more inside oilcloth, placed it flat, and covered it slowly. He pressed the earth down, restored the surface as best he could, and then, after a moment's search in his pouch, drew out a date pit from his supper and planted it in the freshly turned ground. A foolish gesture, perhaps, or perhaps the most fitting one. Let something living rise where the hunger for dominion had been laid away. By the time the eastern horizon paled, he had already left the oasis behind. Dawn in the desert always feels less like a beginning than a revelation of what the night had been protecting. Ridges appeared, stone recovered shape, the horse's coat changed from gray in moonlight to brown under early sun. When he reached the canyon stronghold late that day, Harun met him in the outer court without public sign of relief. In such places questions are asked after water, not before it. So Samir drank, washed the dust from his face, and only then entered the chamber of keepers to report. He said the repository had been reached. He described the ruler's private notes and the seriousness of the obsession growing around the text. He said the manuscript could not be secured by the palace much longer. Then he paused just long enough for truth and silence to weigh equally. Finally, he added that, during his exit, the manuscript had been lost among the festival movements and could not be recovered. It was a lie, but not one spoken lightly. Harun held his gaze for a long time. Older men have a way of hearing what lies protect as much as what they conceal. Whether he believed the report entirely, or understood the deeper act and chose not to name it, Samir never discovered. The moment passed, another assignment was mentioned. The chamber moved on, yet some choices continue inside a person long after others have laid them down. In the nights that followed, Samir sometimes woke before dawn with the image of the buried text fresh in his mind. Not as guilt exactly, but as a question without urgency. Had he preserved a balance or merely postponed another form of desire? Was any secret ever truly hidden in a land like Egypt, where sand remembers shape and human beings are endlessly drawn toward what lies beneath it? Such thoughts, had he clung to them tightly, might have sharpened into unease. Instead, they softened with time. He returned to training tasks, to travel, to observation. The oasis remained where it was. Seasons turned. Somewhere under quiet earth, ink slept, and now we do what sleep stories do best after a stretch of inward effort. We return to safety, we widen the frame, we let both stories settle into the same broad world from which they rose. One hidden pyramid beneath a moon of exact alignment. One buried manuscript beneath a young palm beside still water. Neither ending closes with noise, neither resolves the whole hunger of curiosity. That is good. A bedtime history should not slam the lid on mystery. It should leave a little space for the mind to wander without strain. So let us wander again, see the Nile at night, farther north, carrying a line of moonlight that breaks around reeds and moored boats. See the temple pylon standing in patient silhouette, black against a sky dusted with stars. See storerooms cool and orderly, painted shrines, jars sealed with mud, sleeping courtyards, folded linen, dogs turning in circles before lying down. The last lamp in the scribe's room going softly out. See the desert beyond the cultivated edge, not hostile now, only immense and listening. Beneath that desert are chambers filled with names, with painted grains, with sealed doors, with statues whose stone eyelids have not moved in 3,000 years. Beneath that same desert lie also fragments, lost roots, forgotten copies, broken amulets, and 1,000 ordinary things once touched by hands that expected mourning. Ancient Egypt lasted because it could repeat itself without becoming empty. The same sun, the same river, the same prayers slightly altered by century after century of human breath. The same concern for order, the same tenderness toward preparation, the same wish that life should continue in recognizable form beyond the place where visible breath stops. That continuity is what lingers most beautifully at night. Not merely the grandeur of kings, but the longer patience of a civilization willing to braid together work, worship, language, burial, farming, astronomy, household care, law, image, and dream. It is a large word, civilization, but it was lived in small motions. A bowl lifted, a floor swept, a reed pen sharpened, a prayer whispered over a sleeping child. Perhaps that is why old Egypt so often feels close when the body grows tired. It is full of patterns, and patterns are kind to us when the day has been shapeless. It is full of thresholds, and bedtime itself is a threshold. It is full of attempts to guide the soul safely through dark passages, and sleep is also a kind of willing passage, entered nightly without complete understanding, and yet with trust enough to return. We lay down our tasks. We cross into another state. We do not demand complete control. We accept accompaniment. The ancient Egyptians would have understood that impulse. I think they spent a long time learning how to move gently with the unknown. So let the images begin to blur a little now, not because they are fading away, but because they are making room for rest. The pyramid in moonlight, the corridor walls with stars cut into stone, the cool hidden chamber, the hands of the embalmer laying linen smooth, the temple at dawn, doors opening to incense and hymn, the market at Thebes, loud and warm, the quiet service hallway behind painted walls, the oasis under silver branches, the small date pit pressed into wet earth, Eden. The Nile, always the Nile, moving past all of it, indifferent to crowns, and yet bearing every kingdom in its reflection. There may always be another chamber somewhere beneath the sand. Another broken text in an archive bundle, another story folded inside a symbol no one has yet compared carefully enough. Another secret held not by malice, but by time. Let that thought remain light, not a hook pulling you awake, only a distant soft gleam at the far edge of imagination. Some mysteries do not need solving tonight. Some treasures are best left where moonlight, dust, and memory have already agreed to keep them. The oldest worlds are generous in this way. They let us visit without requiring that we possess. And now there is nothing more to ask of the night. You have traveled far enough. You have gone by river and desert, by temple and tomb, by market lane and hidden archive. And all of it may rest now. If any image still lingers too clearly, let the river take it. If any thought still feels a little too bright, let the desert evening spread over it. Return, in imagination, to the bank of the Nile where we began. The water is dark and slow, the reeds bend, the stars are steady above you. Somewhere nearby, unseen, a small lamp burns in a sheltered room. Somewhere farther away, the pyramids stand in their endless patience, keeping watch without effort. Your breathing can be easy now. Your hands can be still. The mind no longer needs to follow the story onward. It can simply float beside the last of the images until even those grow dim. Let the river move. Let the moon drift higher. Let the old stones keep their silence. And may your sleep, when it comes, be calm, deep, and untroubled, as gentle as water under starlight, and as peaceful as a hidden chamber that has finally been allowed to rest. Long before either of those stories, before Elias lifted a lamp in a hidden corridor, and before Samir measured a doorway in the hush of a palace. Egypt had already spent centuries teaching itself how to endure. That endurance was visible not only in monuments but in calendars. In flood marks cut along the stone, in records of grain, in the practical intelligence that grows when a people live beside a river whose generosity arrives in seasons. One can imagine the patient attention required to watch water rise and fall year after year, to know when silt would renew the fields, when laborers could be summoned, when boats could move more easily, when storehouses must be guarded, when temple feasts should be announced. The land itself instructed the civilization in rhythm. That may be one reason so much of Egyptian life acquired the quality of ritual. Repetition was not dullness, it was alignment. When evening came, rooftops cooled, voices changed, the hard edges of labor softened into story, song, complaint, shared bread, and the simple pleasure of sitting where a breeze might reach. One family mended a sandal strap beside a lamp. Another spoke about a cousin's coming marriage. Someone else recited a humorous tale he had heard in the market. Somewhere in a richer house, a lute was played quietly enough not to disturb older parents. Somewhere in a poor one, a child leaned drowsily against an ant and listened to a story about a wise cat, a lost ring, or a god who disguised himself as a traveler. Every civilization has its state face and its household face. In sleep stories, it is often the household face that keeps us closest, because it reminds us that history was once made of evenings like any evening. People like any people, tired in familiar ways. Inside those temples, morning began before public movement. A door opened in darkness, a priest entered carrying fresh flame. The room smelled faintly of old incense, and stone cooled by night. Water was poured. A statue, thought to be the living image of a divine presence, was approached not casually, but with the courtesy one extends to rank and mystery together. Cloth was changed, offerings were set out, words were spoken that had been spoken many times before, and would be spoken again after the mouths that uttered them had fallen silent for centuries. There is a deep comfort in ceremony not because it surprises us, but because it does not. It returns, it promises the next step. It carries us when personal feeling falters. The Egyptians knew this very well, and festivals, though louder, were structured by the same principle. An image of a god would leave the sanctuary hidden within a shrine and move through the city on the shoulders of priests, accompanied by musicians, by incense, by flowers, by the press of public hope. People who might never enter the innermost spaces of a temple could still witness divine nearness as procession. Children would be lifted to see over shoulders. Vendors would talk more quickly than usual in hopes of greater sales. The fortunate would feast. The less fortunate would still find excitement enough in the altered order of the day. Even joy was ritualized, and that gave it shape. Celebration without shape burns the mind too brightly. Celebration enclosed in rhythm can remain strangely soothing, even in memory. It is useful to linger here a little longer, because when we later move through palace corridors and hidden vaults, we do so against this larger background of order, service, and repeated life. Without that background, the stories shrink into mere adventures. With it, they become part of a civilization's breathing. Elias and Layla were not entering an abstract pyramid. They were entering a world made by people who tracked stars over farmland, who buried amulets beside loved ones, who trusted geometry, because geometry mirrored stability. Samir was not slipping into an anonymous palace, he was crossing the back passages of a state that fed itself on records. Routines, servants, offerings, and authority performed through architectural control. The more softly we hold these contexts, the richer the stories become, without ever needing to shout. As the scholars sat outside their tent, after returning from the hidden pyramid, Layla eventually lifted her head and spoke of a thing she had noticed only at the edge of thought while they were inside. Certain signs near the inner chamber, she said, did not merely indicate stars but intervals between appearances, almost like remembered waiting translated into inscription. Elias turned this over slowly, waiting as a sacred category. Waiting as architecture, waiting as a form of preparation. The idea pleased him more than any sensational explanation could have done. It suggested that the pyramid was not built simply to preserve a burial, but to preserve an experience. The long discipline of watching for rare alignment. The willingness to remain hidden until the sky itself permitted disclosure. In that sense, the structure was less a secret than a patient agreement between earth and season. He slept very little before dawn, though not from fear. The mind, after wonder, often turns with a quiet steadiness that resembles wakefulness while lacking its usual restlessness. He listened to wind moving over canvas. He heard Layla's careful turning pages once or twice as she wrote by low lamp. At one point, a grain of sand ticked against the metal cup beside him, and the tiny sound felt disproportionately clear in the dark. Morning eventually whitened the edges of the tent. The pyramid, when they looked back from a ridge after breaking camp, had almost vanished again into the ordinary grammar of desert forms. Had they not drawn sketches and filled several pages with notation, they might have been tempted to doubt themselves. Yet the uncertainty did not sting. It softened the event rather than diminishing it, making it feel all the more appropriate to a landscape where revelation was never meant to remain fully open. When they finally reached the river settlements again, the smells of cooking and wet earth felt almost extravagant after so much stone. A woman shook a woven mat over a wall. Boys leapt from a bank into shallow water, with laughter too brief to disturb the afternoon. A priest's apprentice hurried along with an armful of folded cloth. Someone, unseen, was pounding coriander. Someone else repaired a fishing net with steady hands. Lila paused there longer than necessary, looking not at any monumental feature, but at the simple traffic of lived existence. Perhaps because the hidden chamber had sharpened her perception, everything now appeared to her as part of the same historical fabric. The sacred and the practical sewn together so closely that separating them would only damage both. Samir's world, too, was full of these returns to the ordinary after moments of concentrated secrecy. After the burial at the oasis and the measured lie before the keepers, he resumed tasks whose modesty protected him from theatrical self-importance. He accompanied a caravan scribe for several days and spent more time checking seals on oil jars than thinking about hidden manuscripts. He crossed fields at dusk, carrying messages about grain allotments. He waited outside a minor official's courtyard while rain, rare and brief, darkened the dust in the street. He ate lentils with two younger trainees who knew nothing of the palace mission, and were currently debating the superiority of roasted onions over fresh cucumbers with an intensity usually reserved for theology. Such mundane returns are essential. They keep the soul from mistaking one charged night for the whole shape of life. Still, the mind carries residues. On certain evenings, when the Brotherhood archive room grew especially quiet and the lamp smoke hung blue in the air, Samir would find his thoughts circling back not to the ruler's greed, but to the manuscript's solemn cadence. He had not read enough to invite danger, yet he had read enough to feel the weight of a language that took passage seriously. It made him kinder, perhaps, to the old human wish not to disappear. He understood better why kings and commoners alike sought words for continuity. His own life had begun in precarity. To survive by speed and instinct is to know how fragile identity can feel. The text had tempted others with power, but beneath that temptation lay a more universal ache, the longing to be carried safely through darkness. Even a thief-turned messenger could recognize that. Harun, without asking direct questions, seemed to notice the inwardness growing in him. One night he assigned Samir to assist an elderly copyist in repairing damaged household accounts from a flood season years earlier. It was almost comic work after palace infiltration. Dry figures, repeated names, small notations on grain, matting, livestock, storage jars. Yet, the old copyist handled each fragment with a concentration so devout that the task became unexpectedly calming. History, Samir realized, did not only live in sacred spells and hidden chambers. It lived in rent tallies, in missing tools, in replacement reeds issued to a clerk, in oil measured for winter lamps. Whole households rose from those lines, whole anxieties, whole hopes. By the time the assignment ended, the agitation left by the palace had thinned. Ordinary record-keeping had restored proportion. This is another of Sleep Content's quiet treasures, the ability to move from the grand to the modest without losing beauty. We need not remain at the highest pitch of meaning. We can drift down into smaller things and discover that they also glow. A folded robe, a shelf of papyrus, the squeak of a leather water bag, reed shadows moving against a wall, the little scrape of a stylus corrected on stone. The old world, when approached gently, is full of such minute comforts. They may not attract the waking mind, which is greedy for plot, but they nourish the drowsy mind, which wants atmosphere, continuity, and the feeling that nothing will demand sudden effort. Imagine, then, an evening in a modest Egyptian home after the market has emptied and the desert has gone purple beyond the last fields. A grandmother sorts beans in a shallow basket, lifting out the small stones by touch more than sight. A child, nearly asleep, insists on hearing the same favorite animal story again. Someone laughs softly from the roof where the day mats have been taken up. A cat slips past a jar stand and curls beside the warmth of a wall. A father repairs a reed mat with thin strips of palm fiber and says little because words have already been used all day. In the corner, an oil lamp burns low enough to make the painted plaster look deeper than it is. No one in that room imagines they are contributing to civilization, and yet civilization is exactly what such rooms sustain. Or picture a temple storehouse in the hour before dawn. Outside, the sky is not yet light, but no longer entirely night. Inside, a keeper checks seals on jars by touch. Another records the opening of a grain chamber. Sand clings to the hem of a linen garment. Somewhere near the sanctuary, a sistrum sounds once and stops. The city beyond the wall is still mostly sleeping. This is the hour in which routine and holiness overlap so completely that they become indistinguishable. To carry bread toward an altar, to trim a lamp, to inventory incense, to sweep a passage before a procession. These are practical acts. Yes, but also acts through which a world tells itself it will continue one more day. There is enormous reassurance in that. When Samir next rode out beyond the city on a minor dispatch, he passed not far from the oasis where the manuscript lay hidden. He did not stop. That restraint pleased him. Some secrets are best honored by not touching them too often in thought. He only glanced once toward the low line of palms and kept to the track. Wind had already remade parts of the surrounding sand. The world, indifferent and faithful, was resuming its long work of concealment. It occurred to him that burial is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a transfer from one kind of keeping to another. In the palace, the text had been kept by ambition. At the oasis, it was kept by earth, water, roots, moonlight, and time. The second arrangement felt wiser. Back in the city, preparations for another smaller festival had begun. And the streets had their now familiar layered energy. Carpenters mending portable shrines, cooks bargaining for cumin, youths tasked with carrying flower baskets as solemnly as if bearing royal seals. Samir moved through them not as a boy skimming pockets, not as an agent of hidden tasks, but simply as another figure among many. It was one of the first times in his life he felt the sweetness of anonymity without hunger attached to it. To belong to a larger rhythm and not need to steal from it was its own quiet luxury. Perhaps that was the deepest change the Brotherhood had given him. Not mastery, not adventure. A place within order. One evening, long after their return, Layla stood on a balcony above the river and watched boats moving as dusk gathered. Lamps appeared one by one along the bank. Somewhere music rose and flattened in the humid air. She thought about the ancient watchers who had once studied the same sky not romantically but attentively, as a text joined to architecture and season. It pleased her to imagine that the people who built the hidden pyramid had not intended immortality in the vulgar sense. Perhaps they wanted recurrence, visibility at the proper moment, memory time to the heavens, a return that depended on patience. She smiled at the thought, and for the first time since the expedition, felt no urge to solve the monument further that night. She simply watched the river. Let us do the same. Let us watch rather than press. A boat passing slowly under starlight, oars dipping, water folding around wood. A dog barking once from a distant bank, palms making dark feathered shapes against the sky. Across the river, a temple front turned into a single block of shadow, with a few lamps at its base. Somewhere inland, under layers of sand, a chamber keeps its arrangement of stars. Somewhere else, beneath a young palm near still water, a manuscript lies in silence while roots think their slow green thoughts around it. None of these things asks us to act. They only ask us to imagine them gently. If you find your own thoughts drifting now, that is all right. Let them drift. The script need not be gripped tightly to do its work. It can become background like river sound, like sandals on packed earth outside a courtyard, like low chanting from a temple farther off than you can clearly place. Sleep history is a generous form because it allows the mind to loosen without abandoning meaning entirely. You are still in the story, even if only as atmosphere now. You are still carried, even if the details have begun to blur into one another. Especially then, so once more we return to the wider land, to floodplain and desert edge, to storehouse and shrine, to field channels glinting at dawn, to boats tied among reeds, to burial goods wrapped for another century of patience, to workers resting in the shade of unfinished stone, to old women telling children not to track mud onto a newly swept floor, to the smell of bread and incense and warm plaster after sunset, to all the many unnoticed repetitions, without which there would have been no pyramids, no pharaohs, no sacred texts, no hidden stories at all. The gold of ancient Egypt is beautiful. The quiet labor beneath it is beautiful too. And perhaps kinder company when the night grows deep. There may be comfort in remembering that almost every person who ever lived in that old world also had a body that tired, thoughts that wandered, worries that rose at night, and a need for rest before another morning. They may have slept on woven mats, on wooden frames beneath linen, on rooftops in the warm season, or behind thick mud brick in winter. They may have listened to insects, dogs, river water, or distant temple songs as they drifted off. Someone perhaps lay awake wondering about a child, a debt, an offering, or the height of the coming flood. Someone else, tired from fieldwork or stonework, fell asleep before the lamp could be pinched out. History is made of sleepers as much as it is of rulers. And perhaps the final tenderness of ancient Egypt lies there. It is so often shown to us as a civilization of monuments and immortal ambition. Yet it was also a civilization of ordinary evenings, of rooms dimming, of sandals being set aside, of stories told softly enough not to wake those already asleep, of breathing slowing in the dark. That small nightly surrender belongs to every century. In that sense, the old world is not so distant now. It rests beside us more quietly than any treasure ever could. So let the last images loosen and spread like mist above calm water. A palm shadow over an oasis, a sealed chamber beneath stone, a copied line of ink drying in a storeroom, festival music carried faintly past a palace wall. A scholar's lamp near midnight, a child in a market lane, a priest opening a sanctuary at dawn, a field waiting for flood, a wrapped body laid carefully into rest. All of them belong to the same wide hush. Now, all of them can recede together into the soft dark where stories no longer ask to be followed and begin simply to keep company while sleep comes nearer.